Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. My name is Nicola Favretto, I'm a research fellow at the University of Leeds, and I'm here today to talk about the interaction between land management, climate change and ecosystem services. Particularly, we will be focusing on the trade-offs between different types of land uses in Southern Africa, taking a case study from a study that we carried out in Botswana's Kalahari. In this webinar, we will first provide a background of degradation and ecosystem services in Botswana's Kalahari, followed by an outline of the aim of this project and the study area. We will explain what analytical framework we use for the analysis of our data and the various mixed methods that have been used for the valuation of ecosystem services. And we will then outline key results and conclusions, followed by some considerations on the usability of our findings and their relevance to policy development, and the presentation of a follow-up study which expanded our initial economic valuation. First of all, when we look at Botswana's rangeland systems, we must bear in mind that these systems are a key source of rural income and delivery of various ecosystem services. Rangeland systems provide food in terms of livestock, so production of meat through cattle and small stocks such as goats and sheep, game meat and wild products. Wild products are naturally found in the areas surrounding where the population lives. Then they provide groundwater, building materials, for example, used as thatching grass or poles for building fences, fuel wood, natural medicines that are used as traditional healing methods, regulation of climate, protection to soil erosion, and a range of recreational and spiritual values that people attach to the land where they're coming from. Now, all of these services are threatened by multiple challenges, mostly increasing levels of poverty combined with land degradation. And what type of land degradation is occurring mostly in these areas? First of all, let's look at this photo at the bottom right of the slide. I took this photo in a private game ranch. What you observe here is extremely dry land, completely encroached by thorny bushes, which make it very difficult to the animals to just move around freely on the land. We also observe a threat of grass cover, and obviously lack of grass cover translates in reduced access to good quality grazing, which means that the animals will not have enough food, particularly during droughts. The area is characterized also by the presence of some dune fields that used to be stable, but as a result of the increasing levels of degradation have been reactivated. So these dune fields are basically starting to move and expand again. And all of this translates into a reduced delivery of the wider range of ecosystem services. And obviously, less capacity to deliver ecosystem services in that land means less capacity to generate economic returns from any sort of human activities that might take place in the area. So the overall aim of this research project was to assess the costs, the benefits, and the trade-offs which are associated with different types of land use and management strategy in the rangeland system. By bringing together mixed economic, social, and environmental dimensions, this research has collected primary data which have covered 4 key land uses. First of all, communal rangelands, and we have as an example in this photo here. You see a quite remote area, and I think the photo is quite self-explanatory. You look how dry is the land, and it's pretty obvious that it's not easy for this lady to find an area, a grazing area, which is suitable to keep her goats and sheep alive. It's a very challenging environment, and particularly when they go through long droughts that might last several years, the survival of the animals is really challenged. Second land use is private cattle ranches. So basically these are privately owned fenced areas that are mostly used for the production of and sale of meat from cattle. Third land use, private game farms. So similarly to the previous one, privately owned fenced areas used for sustaining the game business, either for selling the animals or for hosting commercial hunting. And number 4, wildlife management areas. These are areas that are owned and managed by the state, which aim is achieving mixed objectives. One is sustaining biodiversity and wildlife that can, as a result, attract ecotourism and generate various opportunities to set up businesses there. They should sustain the recreational and aesthetic values of these landscapes, and they are also open to the communal farmers for the collection of wild products and for some grazing. As you can see in the map here, well, first of all, if you look at the national map, we are located in the southwest of Botswana. When you look at the detailed map, you see the red crosses are the project sites where data has been collected, which cover all of the different land uses that we have outlined earlier that are basically coexistent. If you look at the light green area, that is the wildlife management area, which is located just next to the darker areas, which are the fenced private farms, next to the lighter brown areas, which are the communal grazing areas. All of these cover the Kalahari district of Botswana's Kalahari. We used multi-criteria decision analysis, which I will refer to as MCDA, as an analytical framework, which basically gave us the capacity to rank the 4 different land use options that you see here: communal grazing, private ranches, and wildlife management areas. It allows us to rank them by quantifying, scoring, and weighting a mixed range of quantitative and qualitative criteria. So you see this screenshot here is from the final outcome of the MCDA. We will get back to it shortly, but basically if you look at the different colors here, they show how each of the ecosystem services valued, including climate regulation, contribute to generate the overall value of each land use. We have used a range of mixed methods for our analysis. We have integrated policy analysis with the analysis of price data for those ecosystem services that are valued on the market, for example, meat production. We have carried out 12 ecological assessments using biosphere-based sampling around water points and satellite data. Here, without going into detail on the ecological analysis, this is a screenshot of one of the satellite images that have been produced. We have carried out 37 semi-structured interviews with the communal farmers, with the owners of the private ranches, and with a range of policymakers and universities. And then we have combined this with literature review and secondary data analysis. And when data was not directly available on some of the dimensions that we wished to assess, we used benefit transfer, which is a method that allows to take similar data generated for similar landscape and transfer them to the study site and apply them to our study sites. So the overall problem or questions that we have addressed in our study was which land uses and land management strategies are best placed to deliver specific ecosystem services in Kalahari rangelands in Botswana's southern Kalahari district. Now let's have a brief overlook of the main components of our multi-criteria analysis. First of all, we have defined our multi-criteria or the multiple criteria that we wish to analyze that you see on the left hand of this table, which are the various ecosystem services: commercial food, wild food, fuel, construction material, groundwater, genetic diversity, climate regulation, recreation, and spiritual inspiration. Secondly, we have outlined specific indicators that were used to assess each of these criteria. So, for example, for commercial food production, we have calculated the net profit of meat production in terms of US dollars per hectare per year. For fuel, we have looked at firewood collection. For groundwater, again, we have looked at market values of the water extracted in terms of US dollars per hectare per year. Similarly, for climate regulation, we have looked at the total value of carbon sequestered in US dollars per hectare per year. As you can see, some of these variables have an economic value. Some of them are more qualitative. For example, if we look at spiritual inspiration, we have looked at the presence of landscape features or certain species to which a specific spiritual value is attached. Here, without going into the details of this table, this shows how we have used all of our different criteria that again are in the first column on the left, and how we have assessed their performance using these specific indicators that we have just outlined that are here in the second column to assess the performance across our 4 different land uses, which are shown on top of this table. The column on the right provides details on the different valuation methods that have been used to collect the different type of information. So what is shown here basically is that we have put together a range of different data and assessments ranging from quantitative ones, for example, commercial value of food per hectare in US dollars, combined with qualitative ones. So, for example, on rankings from low to high, medium, etc. The multi-criteria analysis framework provides us with methods to translate this mixed type of data into homogeneous multi-criteria scores. So here you see again the same criteria and indicators which are now ranked, which are now valued across the different land uses as a homogeneous score from 0 to 100. These scores are then visualized into these graphs. And what does this graph tell us is that communal livestock grazing delivered the widest range of ecosystem services. Commercial food production combined with collection of wild food, fuel, construction material, climate regulation, and spiritual use. So you see that communal livestock grazing is the land use that has ranked the highest MCDA score. So is the one that has performed at best, followed by wildlife management areas. While the 2 land uses that have achieved the lowest score are the private land uses, private cattle ranches and private game ranches. Let's have a brief overlook into how the value of communal livestock grazing is split among the different ecosystem services. So basically we show that most of the value of communal livestock grazing is generated by commercial food, shown in the blue area, followed by fuel wood, wild food and groundwater, and so on. If we look at this, let's look at the climate regulation component, which is the one in the light blue. We see that climate regulation value is highest in communal livestock grazing here and in private cattle ranches. And this is also translated in total economic values. So for those ecosystem services that have a market value, we have provided a full total economic valuation in US dollars per year. So if we look at climate regulation, we see that communal livestock grazing is estimated to produce a total value of carbon sequestration of over $9 million per year, followed by private cattle ranches estimated at about $5 million per year. What does this tell us? Let's try to understand where do these values come from. So overall here we are saying that when we think about different land uses and we think about their implication for climate dimensions, the communal livestock grazing and the private cattle ranches are the ones that are delivering the highest value. First of all, this value, the value of net carbon sequestration, was assessed using the benefit transfer. So we have looked at published studies in similar landscapes in Southern Africa that have estimated carbon sequestration, and we have transferred that values according to the surface of our study areas. And then using the market value of carbon, or at least mean market values, given that this can be a quite variable range, we have assessed the overall market value of climate regulation. Why these two land uses are ranking at the highest? Because under those land uses there is a higher level of grazing, and intense grazing results in higher levels of land degradation, translated into higher levels of bush encroachment. So you remember when we showed in the beginning this slide that showed this highly bush encroached area as a form of land degradation. These bushes result in higher levels of carbon sequestered in the soil, and therefore on higher climate regulation scores. So here, this highlights a very clear trade-off. On the one hand, we want to maximize climate regulation and maximize carbon sequestration. On the other hand, we do not want to foster bush encroachment because we want to minimize land degradation. So in terms of decision making, we have to be very careful in not increasing woody biomass from land degradation, maybe just because we are trying to pursue carbon credit schemes that are targeting revenue generations. And now let's move to the broader conclusions that can be drawn on these mixed qualitative and quantitative findings. First of all, cattle production, so meat production, is the use that provides the largest financial benefits to private land users. And that was shown in our graph by the largest value produced from commercial food, which are the blue ones. Now, these larger financial benefits also go hand in hand with the generation of broad negative environmental externalities. So there is again a clear trade-off here. And let's take the example in the communal areas. Look at these two photos. These people are trying to sustain the life of their cattle in a completely dry environment. And we have to look at our policy analysis to think that since the 70s, the government has promoted policies aimed at reducing poverty and sustaining meat production, which basically promoted two things. First, land privatization and fencing to sustain a more productive use of land. And second thing, support provided to drilling of boreholes to be able to extract underground water in this very arid environment that should be used for cattle. So look at this photo here. We have a borehole that you cannot see here, but which is connected to this green water tank that collects the water and distributes the water through the animal through this pipe. What our biosphere assessments have shown here is that around the water points, due to the constant presence of the animals that go there to drink water, the land gets more and more degraded to the point that it becomes a desert. Instead of supporting the production of meat, this generates in the long term a decreased capacity to sustain the life of these animals because there is no grazing. As a result of climate change, when they go through extensive droughts, the situation gets even more challenging. And as a result of this, income generating opportunities drop. So this results also in an overall reduced access to other ecosystem services that are not related to commercial food production. In a degrading environment like this one, people will not be able to collect wild products, for example, or other ecosystem services that can be used to generate other types of values. So livelihood diversification opportunities decrease, and income generation opportunities decrease as well. Also, the fencing and the privatization of land has blocked migration routes that animals like the ones in these photos used to take to move across the territory to look for food or water depending on availability. So in different seasons or in different years, depending to droughts, these animals in the past used to be able to move around and find a more suitable place to sustain their living. Now they are enclosed in more limited areas due to the fencing, and this, after a few decades, has resulted in declining wildlife numbers, particularly inside and next to the wildlife management areas. Again, here you have another trade-off. On the one hand, we have policies that try to sustain wildlife through wildlife management areas. On the other hand, we have policies that result in declining wildlife numbers and also in declining economic viability of setting up alternative activities, for example, through community-based natural resource management or ecotourism. So, overall, we see that the opportunities for livelihood diversification to the poorest in society are highly limited. Their livelihoods depend on subsistence hunting, depend on the gathering of wild products, depend on access to the widest range of ecosystem services. And there is a clear need here to assess and establish potential markets for provisioning ecosystem services, for example. So moving away from just focusing all the actions and the policies in sustaining commercial meat production, and revisit the land management policies and strategies that have been sustained since the 70s until now. For example, by limiting the development of boreholes within the communal areas that are in proximity to wildlife management areas, because this does not help the long-term production of meat for these communities, and this does not sustain adequate wildlife health and survival. And back to our title of this webinar. So here we are looking at the interaction between land management, climate change, and ecosystem services. And we conclude that in establishing sustainable land management practices, we really need to look at the trade-offs between the profitability of different types of land management strategies, the social distribution of wealth, the cultural values, the climate implication, and implications for land degradation. All of these components must be considered across different land uses. So we have to think in terms of multifunctional landscapes into this extremely complex system that cannot be approached only from one angle. And for more details on this study, we refer to the journal paper published in Ecosystem Services, which you can see in this slide. Now, we have outlined a range of critiques to the current land management system, but how do these recommendations inform current and future decisions and policy making? And here I would like to give you the example of a final policy workshop that was carried out in the end of the project in Botswana. The workshop was attended from a range of policymakers coming from different sectors with the aim to disseminate our findings and stimulate some discussions and also gather some feedback on the relevance and usability of these findings from the policy audience. So the aim was to inform the review of existing policies, programs, projects on sustainable land management in Botswana and towards the development of new ones. Now, there are some barriers that must be considered here. We must remember that the dominant political or economic interest in the country might not necessarily be aligned to the measures that we have proposed. So, depending on the economic implications of such measures for different stakeholders, or depending on the pressures from lobbying groups, for example, the cattle producer, these pressures might favor or limit particularly policy measures and an overall shift towards sustainable land management. And also, the limited financial resources and limited funding mechanisms that are available to national to district level authorities may limit the capacity to develop on-the-ground activities or to put in place the extension advice that is needed to implement the actions or to establish an adequate monitoring system. So there is really a range of limitations and challenges here in turning these recommendations into action. To further help this process, we have expanded our initial study with a more advanced modeling exercise. So a more advanced economic valuation of the ecosystem services, which was published in this article that you can see here on the Land Degradation and Development Journal, titled Valuing Ecosystem Services in Semi-Arid Rangelands Through Stochastic Simulation. What we did here was to estimate the range of potential monetary outcomes of the rangeland ecosystem services under the 4 different land uses analyzed earlier on. So by forecasting the range of plausible ecosystem values of the different rangeland uses in monetary terms, this follow-up analysis provides policymakers with a tool to assess the outcomes of different land use and management decisions and policies. Just briefly on the key findings of this study. First of all, let's look at this diagram. This shows ranges of ecosystem service monetary values that were created through the monitoring, through the modeling. So we took the same 4 land uses that we analyzed in the MCDA, and we estimated minimum and maximum values for each ecosystem services. We've run iterations through the Monte Carlo modeling system. So we run 10,000 tests that resulted in the generation of these value ranges for the different land uses. What does this graph tell us? Is that public land uses, so the communal grazing on top, followed by the wildlife management areas, are the ones that provide the higher economic value compared to the private land uses below. So if you look at the central area in this graph by the dark green color, this shows that the economic values here are higher for the public land uses than the private ones. Despite the private land uses are the ones that are more profitable in terms of economic returns for meat production. So again, this confirms that it's not all about commercial meat production. It's about looking at that wider range of ecosystem service values. This second diagram explains the uncertainty of the ecosystem values and the variations that we have seen in this previous graph here. So if we look at private game ranges, we see that there is a wider range of value variations compared to the other land uses. These variations are explained by this graph. So, for example, the variability of monetary outcomes under cattle and game ranches, so these two ones here, is strongly correlated to the value produced by key ecosystem services that are linked to meat production. You see the line here, including plant and livestock diversity, you see it here, groundwater extraction here, and profit of meat production. Or under the wildlife management areas, uncertainty about the variability in value distributions is closely tied to difficulties in valuing cultural and spiritual values and recreational values and inspiration. Again, what does this study tells us is it reiterates and confirms our previous MCDA findings. And to conclude, it is vital that sustainable land management policies support the provision and utilization of non-monetary ecosystem services. So, moving forward from privatized commercial meat production to deliver the highest value and return to society, with a view to enhance livelihood diversification opportunities, reducing land degradation, maximizing capacity to mitigate to climate change, and fostering really positive equity impacts on the welfare of Kalahari communities. So again, moving towards multifunctional landscapes. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. I hope you found it interesting. And if you have any question, feel free to contact me to the email address that is shown in the introductory slide. Thank you very much.